The photograph slipped out from the breast pocket of the second-hand coat like a secret the universe had been holding onto for years, and the moment Gilbert Talbot's rough, sun-darkened fingers closed around it, something deep inside his chest shifted in a way it never had before. It was the autumn of 1878, and the trading post at Clearwater Crossing, Colorado, smelled of tanned leather, dried tobacco, and the faint sweetness of molasses from barrels stacked near the back wall. Gilbert had come in with nothing particular on his mind except the bitter cold that had started rolling down from the Rockies like a slow tide, and the fact that the coat on his back had more holes in it than a tin can at a shooting range. He was 31 years old, lean and broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had been carved by wind and sun into something quietly handsome, though he would have been the last man to say so. He worked as a ranch hand for the Callaway outfit about 12 miles east of town, a good enough arrangement that kept his belly full and his hands busy, which was really all he had asked of life since he had ridden into Colorado 4 years prior with a horse, a bedroll, and the stubborn determination to forget a whole life he had left behind in Missouri. He had not been looking for anything that afternoon. He had only been looking for a coat. Old Pete Garrity, who ran the trading post with the suspicious frugality of a man who had survived too many lean winters, kept a rack near the door where he hung second-hand clothing bought from travelers, settlers, and the occasional estate of someone who had not survived the territory. Gilbert had moved along that rack with the dispassionate efficiency of a man shopping for function rather than style, testing fabric between his fingers, checking seams, holding sleeves up to gauge length. The coat he settled on was a deep brown wool, slightly worn at the elbows but solid everywhere else, lined with a flannel that still held its softness. It fit across the shoulders like it had been made for him, which made him feel briefly guilty, as though he were inheriting something that belonged to someone else. He paid Pete $1.25 for it, shrugged off his old coat without ceremony, and pulled the new one on right there in the trading post, because the wind had teeth today and he intended to walk back to the hitching post without getting frostbitten. He was 2 steps out the door when he shoved his right hand into the breast pocket, a habit he had of checking his pockets before riding anywhere, and his fingers touched something stiff and rectangular. He pulled it out thinking it was a receipt or a folded letter, something Pete had neglected to remove, and he nearly tucked it straight into the trash barrel that sat beside the post's front steps. He looked at it instead. It was a tintype photograph, small enough to fit in a palm, mounted on a thin card that had been handled so many times the edges had gone soft. The image was of a young woman seated very straight in a photographer's chair, her hands folded in her lap with a composure that struck Gilbert as practiced rather than natural, as though she were trying very hard to appear calm. She wore a dark dress with small buttons at the collar, and her hair was pinned up in a way that let 2 loose curls fall beside her face, which was pretty in a way that was also serious, the kind of pretty that made you feel like you ought to deserve it before you went ahead and noticed it. Her eyes, even in the flat gray tones of the tintype, had a quality to them that Gilbert could not name right away, and he stood there on the steps of the trading post for a long, cold moment trying to put a word to it. It was not sadness exactly, though there was some of that. It was more like patience, like she was waiting for something she was not altogether sure was coming. On the back of the card, in handwriting that was careful but not entirely at ease with itself, someone had written, "Mae Covington, Hartwell, New Mexico," and below that, as though added as an afterthought, "Do not forget me." Gilbert read those 4 words 3 times. He went back inside the trading post and found Pete Garrity wiping down the counter with a rag that was not doing much for the overall cleanliness of the wood. "Pete," Gilbert said, setting the photograph on the counter, "you know whose coat this was. The brown wool one I just bought." Pete squinted at the photograph, then at Gilbert, then at the rack near the door with the expression of a man reviewing a transaction he had already closed in his mind. "Came in off a family passing through," he said after a moment. "Moving down into New Mexico territory, I believe. Man traded it for supplies. Said his wife made him get rid of it because she'd bought him a new one. He paused. Why? Did you get a name? Covington, I think. Pete leaned forward and looked at the photograph again without touching it. That her, pretty woman. Gilbert picked the photograph up and held it for a moment. The name on the back and the name Pete had just spoken landed together in him like the two ends of a bridge clicking into place, and the result was a certainty he could not entirely explain, only feel. He thanked Pete, walked back out into the cold, untied his horse from the hitching post, and stood there in the street of Clearwater Crossing looking south the way a man might look at a road he has just decided to take. His horse, a steady roan gelding he had named Compass, shifted his weight and blew a breath into the cold air. I know, Gilbert said to the horse, as though Compass had raised the obvious question. I know it does not make a lick of sense. But he was already thinking about the distance to New Mexico. He rode back to the Callaway Ranch and found the foreman, Hank Dillard, mending fence near the east pasture, a man so weathered by the outdoor life that he had come to look like something that had grown naturally from the Colorado soil. Gilbert told him straight that he needed a week, maybe two, that something personal had come up, and Dillard looked at him the way men who have worked together a long time look at each other, reading things that are not said aloud, and then nodded once and said his place would be waiting when he came back, just not to get himself killed doing whatever foolish thing this was. Gilbert packed that night by lamplight, rolling a change of clothes into his bedroll, filling his saddlebags with dried meat and biscuits wrapped in cloth, checking his canteen and his rifle, and the small leather wallet where he kept his savings, which amounted to about $40 and some coin, enough to travel on if he was careful. He tucked Mae Covington's photograph in the breast pocket of his new coat, right where he had found it, and felt the comfortable weight of it there, the way you feel the weight of a thing that has become important before you have fully understood why. He set out before dawn, heading south on the old Trader's Trail that wound down through the high country and eventually into New Mexico territory. The sky above the Rockies was the deep blue-black of a bruise turning, and the stars were so clear and cold that they looked like chips of ice thrown against a dark cloth. Compass moved steadily through the pre-dawn dark, and Gilbert rode without hurrying, thinking about a woman in a photograph he had never met, and the words she had written on the back of her own portrait that sounded less like a caption and more like a plea. Do not forget me. He wondered who had forgotten her. He wondered if the man who had traded away this coat, the man Pete Garrity had identified as Covington, had even known she was in the pocket. He wondered what kind of woman had that particular look in her eyes, that patient, waiting look, and what she was waiting for, and whether whatever it was had ever arrived. He told himself, in the logical and sensible part of his mind, that this was not his business. That he was a ranch hand from Missouri with no family, no particular prospects, and no reason to go hunting down a stranger in New Mexico territory over a photograph he had found in a used coat. He told himself this all through the first day of riding, and it did not change anything about his direction. By the time he reached the first decent town south of Clearwater Crossing, a place called Adobe Flats that was mostly a saloon, a livery, and a cluster of adobe buildings trying to become something more, Gilbert had stopped arguing with himself and simply committed to the fact of it. He had found the photograph. He had read the words. He was going to Hartwell, New Mexico, and he was going to find Mae Covington and return her photograph, and whatever happened after that would be whatever happened after that. It was simple enough in the stating. Adobe Flats had a small restaurant attached to the saloon, run by a Mexican woman named Donna Reyes, who served beans and salt pork that were better than anything Gilbert had eaten in weeks, and he sat at the counter and ate with the photograph propped against his coffee cup, looking at it while he ate in a way that he would have been embarrassed to explain to anyone watching. The woman behind the counter noticed the photograph when she refilled his coffee. Your wife. she asked, with the directness of a person who has decided that courtesy requires getting right to the point. "No," Gilbert said. "I found her photograph in the pocket of a coat. I am taking it back to her." Donna Reyes looked at the photograph, then at Gilbert with an expression that was equal parts skepticism and something warmer. "Hartwell is 4 days south of here," she said. "Maybe 5, depending on the weather." She refilled his coffee. "That is a long ride for someone who is not your wife." "Yes, ma'am," Gilbert agreed. She smiled then, a slow smile that knew something. "Maybe she will be," she said, and turned back to her work without elaborating. And Gilbert sat with his coffee and the photograph, and found that the idea, which should have been absurd, did not feel absurd at all. He rode 4 more days through territory that shifted from the high, cold pine country of southern Colorado into the redder, drier landscape of New Mexico, where the sky seemed wider somehow, pressing down on the land with an enormous blue weight, and the mesas rose from the earth like the ruins of something ancient and deliberate. He slept under stars more nights than not, wrapped in his bedroll beneath Compass's patient watch, and he thought about what he knew of Mae Covington, which was almost nothing, and what he imagined of her, which was considerably more, and the space between those two things was the entire territory of his hope. On the 4th day he began encountering other travelers heading south, and he asked each of them about Hartwell. Most knew it, a small cattle town that had set itself up around a water source near the base of a particular red mesa, making it something of an oasis in the surrounding dryness. It had a post office now, someone told him, and a hotel of sorts, and a woman who ran a seamstress shop out of her house on the eastern end of town, the best seamstress in 40 miles. Gilbert asked the name of the seamstress, thinking it was the kind of detail that might help him find who he was looking for. "Covington," the man said. "Mae Covington. Widow woman, I think, though she's young for it. Real fine work." Gilbert absorbed this information with a steadiness that surprised him, because widow meant that the man named Covington who had traded the coat in Pete Garrity's trading post was not Mae's husband currently living, which raised the immediate and wrenching question of what had happened. He did not ask the traveler for details because it was not that man's story to tell. He thanked him and rode on, and the word widow settled into him with a quietness that was not unfeeling but simply respectful, making space for a grief he did not yet understand the shape of. He arrived in Hartwell on a dry, golden afternoon in late October, the kind of afternoon where the light comes in sideways and makes everything look like a painting of itself. The town was small but not struggling, maybe 40 buildings arranged along 2 unpaved streets, with cattle pens to the north and a water tower that rose above everything else like an exclamation point. The smell of the place was dust and horses and mesquite smoke from cook fires, and it felt lived in, the way a place feels when people have decided it is worth the effort of staying. He found the seamstress shop on the eastern end without difficulty, because Hartwell was small enough that directions consisted mostly of counting buildings. There was a hand-painted sign above the door that read Covington Sewing and Alterations, the lettering done with a care that suggested whoever had painted it had wanted it to be right. The door was open despite the season, probably because it was still warm enough here in the afternoon, and Gilbert tied Compass to the post out front, removed his hat, and stood at the door for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. He could hear someone inside, the soft measured sound of cloth being cut, a pair of scissors working through fabric with the confident rhythm of a person who has done this thousands of times. He knocked on the door frame, and the sound stopped. "Come in," said a voice, and the voice was enough to make Gilbert understand that the photograph had not been doing her justice. He stepped inside. The shop was a front room of what was clearly also a home, organized with the kind of meticulous tidiness that comes from having very little space and needing every inch to work. There were bolts of fabric on shelves along one wall, spools of thread arranged by color on a board, A dress formed near the window, wearing a half-finished garment in blue calico. The afternoon light came in warm through the window and fell across the work table at the center of the room, where Mae Covington stood with a pair of scissors in her hand and a length of checked wool laid out before her, looking at Gilbert Talbot with eyes that were exactly as he had known they would be from the photograph. That patient, waiting quality, though the patience had a certain sharpness to it now, an alertness that had not quite translated into the image. She was 26 years old, though she looked both older and younger than that depending on the light. Older because of something she had been through, and younger because of the life that still showed in her face despite it. She was not tall, but she stood straight, and the dark dress she wore was nearly identical to the one in the photograph, though this one had a small patch of yellow near the cuff that suggested she had mended it herself, which made Gilbert feel tenderly toward the patch in a way he could not have explained. "Can I help you?" she said. Gilbert realized he was holding his hat and had been standing in the doorway without speaking for an embarrassingly long moment. Cleared his throat and stepped fully inside. "My name is Gilbert Talbot," he said. "I work up at the Callaway Ranch in Colorado, or I did until about a week ago. I bought a coat at a trading post in Clearwater Crossing. It was a second-hand coat, brown wool. The man who ran the post said it came in from a family named Covington who were moving south." He reached into the breast pocket of the coat, the very coat in question, and drew out the small tintype photograph. "I found this in the pocket. I thought you might want it back." He held the photograph out toward her, and Mae Covington looked at it from across the work table, and something moved across her face that was large and complicated and very carefully contained, the way a river contains itself within its banks even when it is running high. She set the scissors down. She walked around the work table and came to him, and she took the photograph from his hand with a steadiness that clearly cost her something, and she looked at it for a long time without speaking. "Where did you say you found this?" she asked finally. Her voice was steady but not entirely. "In the breast pocket," Gilbert said. "I bought the coat, walked out, put my hand in the pocket, and there it was. And you rode down from Colorado to return it?" "Yes, ma'am." She looked up at him then, and the look she gave him was both searching and direct, the look of someone who has learned not to trust things too quickly and is assessing whether this is something to trust. "That is a long way," she said. 4 or 5 days riding." 4.5, he said. She looked back at the photograph. "My husband dropped this coat at a trading post," she said quietly. "He got a new one. I told him to make sure to check the pockets first." There was a quality in her voice when she said it that told Gilbert it was a small sorrow laid on top of larger ones. He was not always careful that way. "I am sorry," Gilbert said, meaning it, "about your husband." Her chin lifted slightly. "He passed 4 months ago," she said. "Fever. It came fast." A pause. "Thank you for saying so." There was a silence between them that was not uncomfortable, which surprised Gilbert, because he was not a man who generally navigated silence with any great ease. He was standing in the shop of a woman he did not know, who had just received back a piece of herself that had been lost, and the moment had a weight to it that he felt he should not break carelessly. "I will leave you to it," he said, and moved to replace his hat. "Wait," she said. He stopped. She was looking at the photograph in her hand, not at him, when she spoke. "I wrote that on the back myself," she said. "Do not forget me." "I wrote it before he left for a cattle drive, so he would have something of mine with him. And then he took it on the drive and brought it back, and I thought he had kept it safe. But when he traded this coat months before he died, he must have forgotten it was there." She paused. "It has been sitting in a second-hand rack in Colorado for the better part of a year." Gilbert thought about those 4 words written in careful, slightly uncertain handwriting, and what it meant that they had traveled from New Mexico to Colorado in the pocket of a traded coat, and then come back again, returned by a stranger on a horse who had nothing better to do with himself than care about a thing like this. "Well," he said carefully, "it has been returned now." She looked at him, really looked, in the way people rarely look at each other in ordinary encounters. "You rode 4.5 days to return a photograph to a person you did not know," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Why?" He turned his hat in his hands and tried to answer that honestly. "Because it said 'Do not forget me,'" he said, "and it seemed like someone should make sure it got back to the person who wrote it." Mae Covington was quiet for a moment. Then something shifted in her expression, not dramatically, not in the way of a story that wants to signal a turning point, but in the small and genuine way of a real person whose defenses have encountered something they did not expect. "Are you staying in Hartwell tonight?" she asked. "I had planned to find the hotel and then head back north tomorrow," he said. "The hotel is not much," she said, "but come back here for supper this evening if you like. It is the least I can do, and I make a good stew." Gilbert Talbot had been raised in Missouri by a practical mother who had taught him that offers made in genuine good faith should be accepted in the same spirit. "I would be grateful," he said. He found the hotel, which was indeed not much, a set of 4 rooms above a general store, bare but clean, the kind of place that charged 50 cents a night and expected no complaints about the thin mattress or the single window. He put Compass up at the livery, where a boy of about 15 took the reins with the seriousness of someone doing important work and promised to feed and water him well. And Gilbert paid him fairly because he believed in paying people fairly, and because Compass deserved someone who thought the work mattered. He walked the town in the late afternoon, which did not take long. Hartwell was the kind of small western town that had ambitions of becoming more than it was, which you could tell by the fact that someone had taken the trouble to build a small schoolhouse, unpainted but solid, and a church that was not yet finished but had all 4 walls. There was a post office operating out of a corner of the general store, and a barber shop, and a saloon called the Mae Covington, which was doing business even at this hour, the sound of a badly tuned piano drifting out through its slatted doors. There was a water trough in the middle of the main street, and a general air of people working hard at the project of making something out of a difficult landscape, which Gilbert found more admirable than picturesque. He returned to Mae Covington's shop at the time she had indicated, just as the sun was going behind the mesa, and the temperature was dropping with the sudden efficiency of the high desert evening. She had put a tablecloth on the table in the back room where she evidently also ate her meals, and the stew was on the stove in an iron pot, and smelled of beef and dried chili, and something faintly herbal that he could not identify, but that made him think of warmth in a generalized and comforting way. Her name, Mae, suited her in the way that some names just suit their people. There was nothing fussy or overstated about her, nothing that required flourish to understand. She had changed out of her working dress into something clean and simpler, and she had let her hair down from its pins. And Gilbert, who had seen the photograph and thought the woman in it serious and still, was now revising his understanding somewhat, because the woman who moved around her small kitchen was not still. She had a quality of directed energy, a purposefulness that expressed itself in the decisive way she stirred the pot and cut the bread and set things on the table. The way someone does when they are accustomed to doing everything for themselves and have made their peace with it but are not entirely at peace. They ate and they talked, and Gilbert discovered that Mae Covington was the daughter of a schoolteacher who had moved west from Ohio when she was 7 and had not moved back. She had grown up in New Mexico, had married Thomas Covington at 22, a cattleman who had been likable and unreliable in approximately equal measure, and had set up the sewing business 3 years ago because she understood early on that her husband's income was going to be uncertain, and she needed something that was her own. She talked about Thomas without bitterness, which impressed Gilbert, because bitterness would have been understandable, only with the careful plainness of a person describing what was real rather than what was wished for. She asked about him in the direct way she seemed to do everything, and he found, to his own surprise, that he told her things he had not talked about in years. That he had grown up in Missouri on a farm that had not survived the war, that the war had taken his older brother and changed his father into someone quieter and less present than the man Gilbert had known as a child, and that when his parents passed within a year of each other in the early 1870s, he had decided to go west not because he had anywhere particular to go, but because west was a direction, and he had needed a direction more than a destination. He had drifted from Kansas into Colorado and found the ranch work, and it had suited him, the physical simplicity of it, the way it required nothing of him emotionally beyond competence and reliability, which were things he could provide without opening anything he had been keeping closed. Me listened to all of this without interrupting, with a quality of attention that was not passive but active, the way a person listens when they are genuinely interested rather than simply waiting for their own turn to speak. When he finished, she said, "You have been alone a long time." It was not a judgment, only an observation, but it landed squarely in the middle of something true. "Yes," he said. "So have I," she said, "though I was technically married." He looked at her, and she held his gaze with that same directness, and there was something between them in that moment that was too new to be called anything but a beginning. He stayed 2 nights in Hartwell instead of 1, not because he had decided to, but because the next morning he found himself walking to Me's shop without exactly planning to, and she answered the door with her scissors in her hand and the slightly self-conscious look of someone who had been wondering whether he would come back. And she said, "I am just cutting a pattern for Sarah Beaumont's wedding dress. You can sit if you like." And he sat, and they talked the whole morning while she worked. And by noon, he felt more like himself than he had in years, and was not entirely sure what to do with that. The second evening she walked him to the edge of town, where the desert opened out toward the mesa in the dimming blue of dusk, and they stood looking at it together without speaking for a while, which was something Gilbert recognized as significant because he had been raised to understand that the kind of quiet you could share with a person was a different and more telling thing than the kind of quiet you could only share with yourself. "When will you go back?" she asked. "Tomorrow, I suppose," he said. "Dillard is holding my place, but not forever," she nodded. She was looking at the mesa, not at him. "I am glad you came," she said. "It would have bothered me, I think, if that photograph had just stayed in Colorado. It sounds foolish." "It does not sound foolish," he said. "Not to me." She turned and looked at him, and the last of the desert light was on her face, and her eyes had that quality from the photograph, that patience, except that up close and in this moment it did not look like waiting for something uncertain. It looked like something steadier, like a person who has decided that whatever was coming could come and they would be all right regardless. Which was, Gilbert thought, one of the more beautiful things he had ever seen on a human face. "Gilbert," she said. "Me," he said at the same moment, and they both stopped, and then both started to say something else, and then both stopped again, and she laughed, a quiet, real laugh that she seemed slightly surprised by, and he found himself smiling in a way that used muscles he had forgotten about. "Write to me," she said, "when you are back." "I will," he said. "Will you write back?" "I will," she said. He rode north the next morning with the photograph still in his coat pocket, because she had pressed it back into his hand the night before with a small, deliberate motion and said, "Keep it. You rode 4.5 days for it. It should mean something." And he had understood that she was not giving the photograph away casually, that she was giving it to him as a specific and considered thing, which meant more than he thought she intended him to know it meant, though by her expression he thought she did not mind him knowing. He got back to the Callaway Ranch in early November, and Hank Dillard looked him over with the assessing eye of a man who has seen a lot of hands come back from leave, and can read in their faces what kind of leave it was. He did not say anything beyond, "You are back, good. East pasture fence needs mending," and Gilbert went and mended it, and life resumed its familiar shape, except that now there was a letter to write in the evenings by lamplight, and he took more care with that than he had taken with anything in a long time. He was not a natural letter writer. He stared at the paper for a long time before he started, and he crossed things out and started again. And the final letter he sent was shorter than he had intended, but more honest than most things he had said in years. He told her about the ride back north, about the way the landscape changed from the red desert to the pine country, and how he had stopped thinking of them as opposite and started thinking of them as the same territory seen in different moods. He told her about the ranch and the fence and Hank Dillard's complete lack of sentimentality about everything. He told her he had thought about Hartwell the whole way home, and that this was not a thing he said to be charming, only to be accurate. Her letter came back 3 weeks later, addressed in that careful, slightly uncertain handwriting he recognized from the back of the photograph. She told him about Sarah Beaumont's wedding dress, which had required 3 fittings and a great deal of patience on both sides. She told him about the winter coming into the high desert, how different it was from the cold he described in Colorado, drier and more sudden, the kind of cold that surprised you because it arrived without the gradual preparation of true mountain weather. She told him about a dispute between 2 ranchers on the north side of town that had occupied most of Hartwell's collective attention for 2 weeks and been resolved anticlimactically by one rancher's cattle simply choosing to relocate themselves through a fence gap that both men had been too proud to mention. She told him she had thought about their conversation on the edge of town more than once, and that she was glad he had come, and that she hoped he might come again. He came again in February. He rode 3 days in weather that was sharper than anything he had experienced in Colorado that winter, the kind of cold that made the sagebrush crackle underfoot and turned the sky a pale, bleached blue. And he arrived in Hartwell with frost on his coat collar and a paper-wrapped bundle in his saddlebag that contained a length of calico he had bought at the trading post in Clearwater Crossing, because Pete Garrity had had a new shipment come in and the color, a deep blue-green, had made Gilbert think immediately and helplessly of Mae Covington. He was aware that buying fabric for a woman you had met twice and corresponded with for 3 months was exactly the sort of thing his practical Missouri mother would have called a declaration, and he supposed it was, and he rode with that knowledge settled comfortably in his chest. She opened the door of the shop when she heard Compass on the street outside, which meant she had been listening, which meant something to him. She was wearing a work apron over her dress and her hands had a pin stuck through the back of the left one, because she had been in the middle of something and had set it down without removing the pin, and she looked at him with a light in her expression that she did not bother to dim, which was the most direct and unguarded thing he had seen from her, and it made his heart perform an activity he could not name. "You came," she said. "I said I would come again," he said. She reached out and picked a piece of ice from the lapel of his coat and dropped it onto the porch planks. "Come inside," she said. "You look frozen solid." She made him coffee while he sat at the work table, warming his hands around the cup, and she did not go back to her work but sat across from him, and they talked for 2 hours without either of them noticing the time move, the way it sometimes happens between 2 people who have reached the particular intimacy of understanding each other's references without having to explain them. He told her stories about Missouri, things he had not thought about in years, a creek near his father's farm where the fishing was so good it seemed almost dishonest, a neighbor woman named Mrs. Pearl who made a particular kind of corn bread that he had been trying to recreate in his mind ever since, and never quite succeeding. She told him about Ohio, which she barely remembered, and the teacher her father had been, strict and fair and secretly more affectionate than he allowed himself to seem, and the one-room schoolhouse where she had learned everything she knew about words and letters and the importance of handwriting, which she delivered with a self-aware smile that acknowledged her handwriting was imperfect but had been improved by care. He gave her the calico, and she held it up against the winter light from the window and was quiet for a long moment. "It is a beautiful color," she said. "I thought so when I saw it," he said. She lowered the fabric and looked at him over it. "You thought of me when you saw it," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," he said. He did not look away. She folded the calico with the precise, loving attention she gave to fabric and set it on the shelf beside the bolts of thread in a position that was clearly chosen to be prominent, and Gilbert filed this away as information. He stayed 4 days. He helped her carry supplies from the general store, because a shipment of thread and interfacing had come in, and the boxes were heavy, and he fixed a hinge on the back door of her shop that had been drooping for months, and he took meals with her every evening at the table in the back room, and on the third evening they were washing the dishes side by side in the small kitchen, which required them to stand close because the kitchen was not designed for two people. And at some point, Gilbert became aware that the conversation had paused, and they were simply standing close to each other in a warm, lamplit room in the middle of the desert, and the awareness of it was so immediate and so complete that he turned to look at her and she was already looking at him. "I think," Mae said carefully, "that you did not come back just to return a length of calico." "No," he said, "and I do not think you rode 3 days in February weather just to fix a hinge." "No." She searched his face with that direct, assessing look of hers. "Then tell me what you are here for, Gilbert Talbot," she said, "because I would like to know it plainly." He set the dish towel down and turned to face her fully, which felt like the most deliberate thing he had done in years. "I came back because I have not been able to stop thinking about you since October," he said. "I came back because your letters are the best part of my days, which is a thing I did not expect and would not have predicted, and because I think, Mae, that you are a person I would very much like to know for a longer time than I have so far known you." He paused. "And because I am fairly certain the feeling is not entirely one-sided, though I am prepared to be corrected on that point if I have misread something." She looked at him for a long moment, and the patience in her eyes was there again, but not the waiting. The patience was the thing itself now rather than the holding place for something absent. "You have not misread anything," she said softly. He reached out slowly and took her hand, which was a small hand, strong-fingered from the needle and shears, and she looked down at their joined hands and then back up at him, and the expression on her face was not the composed, self-protecting thing he had seen in the photograph. It was open and real and a little bit wondering, the face of a person encountering something good after a time of doing without. He did not kiss her that evening. It felt too important to rush. But when he left the kitchen they were still holding hands, and when they parted at the doorway of the shop to say good night, the parting was slow and slightly reluctant on both sides. And this felt like enough for now, more than enough, like the kind of beginning that was solid because it was not hurried. On the fourth morning, when he saddled Compass and prepared to ride north again, she came out of the shop and stood in the cold morning air without her coat, which he noticed because she had gone out without it deliberately, he thought, because she had come quickly and it was an impulsive choice. And this was among the most significant things she had done in his presence because Mae Covington was not an impulsive person. She said, "Come back in spring." He said, "Yes." She said, "Gilbert, come back for good." He held her gaze in the cold February morning, and the desert around them was very still, and he thought about the ranch and Hank Dillard, and the 12 miles of Colorado fence line, and the whole practical apparatus of the life he had built up there in the 4 years since he had ridden into Clearwater Crossing with nothing. And he thought about all of that alongside Mae Covington standing barefoot, almost on the cold porch of her seamstress shop, asking him to come back for good. And the two things were not even remotely equal in weight. "I will need to give Dillard proper notice," he said, "and settle some things, but yes, Mae, I will come back for good." She pressed her lips together and nodded, and her eyes were bright but controlled, and she went back inside before the cold got too serious, and Gilbert rode north with the kind of resolution that sits in a man differently from uncertainty, heavier and more settled and better. He returned to the Callaway Ranch and found Hank Dillard where he always found him, somewhere near fence, and told him straight. Dillard was quiet for the length of time it took him to spit and reseat his hat on his head. "You found a woman," he said. "Yes," Gilbert said, "in New Mexico." "Yes." Dillard looked at the fence line and then back at Gilbert. "She a good woman?" "The best I have met," Gilbert said, and meant every syllable. Dillard nodded slowly. "Give me 3 weeks to find another man. You train him on the East Pasture routine before you go, and I will call us even." Gilbert trained Dillard's new hire, a quiet young man named Pete Avery who was 22 and green but earnest, and he showed him the east pasture and the water schedule and the particular temperament of the Callaway cattle, which required understanding in the way that all living things require understanding. He packed his belongings into the saddlebags and the bedroll, which did not take long because the entirety of what Gilbert Talbot owned in the world fit across the back of one horse, and he went to Pete Garrity's trading post and bought a length of blue ribbon and a small jar of honey, because Mae had mentioned in a letter that good honey was hard to come by in Hartwell, and he headed south on the first day of April 1879, with his whole life in motion. He arrived in Hartwell on the 6th day of April, and the desert was in the early stages of its brief and spectacular spring, the kind of spring that you would not believe in if you had only seen the place in winter, yellow flowers appearing from the dry ground in clusters along the roadside, and the air carrying a warmth that felt like a door opened rather than a weight lifted. He rode into town at noon on a bright day, and there were people in the street going about their business, and he saw me before she saw him, because she was coming out of the general store with a basket on her arm, and she was talking to someone, a woman her age who was making large gestures with her free hand, and Mae was listening with that focused look she had and nodding occasionally. And then she looked up at the sound of compass in the street, and everything about her face changed. She did not run, because she was Mae Covington and she did not run in the street, but she walked toward him at a pace that communicated the same information, and when he stepped down from compass she was there, and he took her hand, and then he did what he had not done in February because he had needed to be sure, and she had needed to be sure, and now they were. And he kissed her there in the middle of Hartwell's Main Street in the April sun, with her basket on her arm and the general store behind her, and the whole small, attentive town of Hartwell bearing witness. There was, he learned later, considerable commentary about this event at the Mesa Tan Saloon for the next week, all of it favorable. He moved into the livery owner's spare room while they arranged things, because there was a proper way to do things, and both of them were people who understood the value of doing them properly. He went to Mae's house for meals, and they talked about the future with the practical directness of two people who had been alone long enough to know what they wanted, and to communicate it without unnecessary ornamentation. Mae had her shop and her income and her place in Hartwell's small community, which was a real thing and worth considering seriously. Gilbert had $40 and considerable skill with cattle and fence and horses, and the general physical work of making a Western life function. Between them, this seemed like a sufficient foundation. He found ranch work about 8 miles west of Hartwell, with a rancher named Emmett Burke who had more land than hands, and was glad of someone with Gilbert's experience. Burke was a plain-spoken man in his 50s with a gray beard and an honest face who paid fairly and did not talk more than necessary, which suited Gilbert, who appreciated clarity in a working relationship. The arrangement was wages plus a small cabin on the property that Gilbert could use, though he planned very shortly to have a more permanent arrangement that would make the cabin less relevant. He proposed to Mae Covington on a warm April evening, 11 days after arriving back in Hartwell for good, sitting on the edge of the porch of her shop with the desert turning colors around them and the first stars appearing above the mesa. He did not have a ring, because he had not thought to buy one yet and had been trying to find the right moment, and the right moment had arrived before the ring had, so he said so plainly. He told her that he had found her photograph in a coat pocket in Colorado and ridden 4.5 days south without any better reason than that someone should not forget her, and that in the time since, she had become the most important person in his life without apparently trying very hard to do so, which he suspected was exactly the kind of person she was, important without trying, good without effort, the kind of person whose presence makes the life around her better. He said he would like to spend his whole remaining life in her proximity, if she would allow it. Mae Covington, who did not cry easily and had not cried in front of him once in the time he had known her, was quiet for a moment when he finished. And then she said, "Yes, Gilbert," in a voice that was not entirely steady, and he thought that was about the finest sound he had ever heard from a human throat. He bought a ring from the general store, a plain silver band that was the best the store offered, and Mae wore it with the same matter-of-fact affection she gave to everything she valued, which was to say she wore it constantly and treated it as a settled fact rather than a statement. They married in Hartwell on a Saturday morning in late May, in the unfinished church that had acquired 4 additional walls and a roof since Gilbert's first visit but had not yet achieved interior plastering. So the ceremony took place with the rough adobe walls visible behind the minister, which Mae said she liked. It suited the territory, nothing pretending to be finished when it was still in the process of becoming. The minister was a Methodist man named Reverend Graves, who had the comfortable manner of someone who has conducted enough weddings to know that what matters is not the ceremony, but the 2 people standing in the middle of it. There were perhaps 20 people present, which was most of Hartwell, including Emmett Burke and his wife Clara, and the woman Mae had been talking to outside the general store on the day Gilbert rode back in, whose name was Ruth Ferris, and who was Mae's closest friend in town, and who had expressed her opinion of Gilbert Talbot from the beginning in the language of a person who had been waiting for someone adequate to come along for Mae and was cautiously pleased. Mae wore the blue-green calico Gilbert had brought her from Colorado, made into a dress of her own design and construction, fitted perfectly because of course it was, and Gilbert wore his best shirt and the brown wool coat that had started the whole thing, and the day was warm enough that he carried the coat rather than wearing it, and Mae saw him with it over his arm, and something passed over her face that was large and private and whole. After the ceremony there was food at the Burke's house, Clara Burke having organized this with a thoroughness that suggested she had been planning it longer than the invitations indicated, and there was dancing outside on the packed earth of the yard, someone playing a fiddle with more enthusiasm than precision, and the evening was warm and lit by lanterns strung between posts, and it was the kind of evening that settles into the memory as a kind of landmark, a before and after point. The night you were no longer the person you had been, but the person you were going to be from here forward. Gilbert danced with me twice and then stood at the edge of the yard holding her hand while others danced, watching the lantern light on her face, and the word wife sat in his mind with the solidity of something structural, something that was holding other things up. He moved his few belongings into Mae's house that same week, the house behind the shop, which was small but well arranged and had accumulated evidence of her in every corner, the thread collection she had organized by hue, the books she kept on a shelf beside the window where she could reach them easily, the photograph she now hung on the wall of the bedroom in a frame she had made herself from 2 pieces of flat wood sanded smooth. The photograph that had traveled from Hartwell to Colorado and back again, and had set the whole thing in motion. She hung it level and stepped back to look at it, and he came to stand behind her and they looked at it together, the small, serious-eyed woman in the photographer's chair, and he thought about what she could not have known when she sat for that photograph, that it would be forgotten in a coat pocket in a trading post in Colorado, and found by a man who would ride 4.5 days for no good reason, except that he could not simply put it back. "You look different," he said, looking at the photograph and then at her. "I look different than I felt when that was taken," she said. "I was not unhappy exactly, but I was waiting, I think." "For what?" She turned to look at him. "I'm not sure I knew at the time," she said, "but I think this." He put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and the evening was coming in through the window, and Hartwell was going about its business outside, and the photograph hung on the wall with its 4 careful words on the back that no one could see, but both of them knew were there. The first year of their marriage was the kind of year that builds a life, the unsexy, essential kind of building that happens in the particulars of shared routine. Mae's business grew, the reputation of her work spreading in the way that good work spreads in small communities, through word and recommendation. And by the end of their first year together, she had established herself as the seamstress people would travel 30 miles to see. Her clients coming from surrounding towns and ranches, with projects that required the kind of careful, considered work that Mae applied to everything. She took on a young local woman named Eliza as a part-time helper, teaching her with the same patient thoroughness she brought to all things. And Gilbert saw in Mae's teaching the inheritance of her schoolteacher father, the same quiet firmness, the same refusal to accept less than a person was capable of. His work with Emmett Burke settled into a rhythm he respected, the long days of cattle work and fence, and the particular ongoing negotiation between human ambition and the landscape's indifference to it. He liked Burke, who paid him in honest wages and occasionally in conversation, which was rarer and therefore more valuable. The West pasture needed a water system improved, and Gilbert designed and built one over the course of 3 weeks that reduced the water time by half, and Burke clapped him on the shoulder and said nothing in particular but gave him a raise the following month, which was the form of praise Gilbert understood best. They were happy. He wanted to be precise about this because happiness was not something he had ever handled carelessly, and he understood that it was not a constant state but a prevailing one, that life was still life and still had its difficulties and its gray mornings and its moments of friction, but that the prevailing quality of his days now was something he would call happiness without reservation or qualification. He woke next to me, and she was already awake half the time, lying with her eyes open looking at the ceiling in the quiet way she thought, and he would lie there beside her in the early light and feel the warmth of her next to him, and think that he had found this by accident, by a coat in a trading post, by a photograph in a pocket, by a decision that made no logical sense, and he was grateful for the accident in a way that was large enough to fill all the practical containers he had built around himself. In the spring of their second year together, Mae told him at breakfast one morning, setting down her coffee cup with a deliberateness that told him she had rehearsed this moment in her mind, that she was expecting a child. Gilbert sat with this information for the length of time it took him to cross the kitchen and take her face in both his hands and look at her, and what he saw in her face was everything, the joy and the apprehension and the history of loss that colored everything for her, and he said, "We will be all right, Mae. You will be all right," because that was what was needed more than anything else, and she closed her eyes and leaned her forehead against his chest, and he held her there in the morning kitchen of their house behind the seamstress shop in Hartwell, New Mexico, and the future was coming and they were standing in it together. The pregnancy was healthy, which Mae received as a gift she was almost afraid to hold. She continued working through most of it, which no one was surprised by, because Mae Covington did not stop working for anything less than a compelling reason, and the pregnancy, aside from the first few weeks of morning difficulty, was not a compelling reason. She altered her own clothing as she needed to with the matter-of-fact expertise of a person who understood the relationship between a body and its garments better than anyone, and she continued to see her clients, and sew her seams and teach Eliza and run her business. And Gilbert watched all of this with a love that was sometimes so large it was briefly alarming, because he had not known he had room for it. Their son was born in December of 1880, a cold night with the wind coming off the mesa with real intention, and the birth was attended by the town's doctor, a capable man named Dr. Orrin Hayes, who had the steady calm of someone who had delivered enough babies to know that this was simply one of the things human bodies did and would do. The boy came into the world with a full voice and no apparent confusion about whether he wanted to be there, and Mae held him and looked at him with an expression that Gilbert had not seen on her before, something entirely unguarded and undefended and complete. They named him Robert Thomas Talbot, Robert for no one in particular except that it was a solid name and they both liked it, Thomas after Mae's late husband, because she felt it was the right thing to do and Gilbert agreed, because it was, because Thomas Covington had been a man with failings who had nonetheless been part of what brought me to this moment, and it cost Gilbert nothing to honor that. Robert was a large, healthy baby with Gilbert's dark coloring and me's serious eyes, which gave him from the beginning the air of a person who was very gravely considering the situation. He ate well and slept adequately and grew with the determined efficiency of something well tended, and the household behind the seamstress shop, which had been orderly and quiet, became something louder and more complex and infinitely more alive. The years moved the way years do when they are full of living, not quickly but with a forward momentum that you notice when you turn and look back at the distance covered. Robert learned to walk and then to run and then to talk, and his talking, when it arrived all at once in complete sentences that surprised everyone including me, who had been expecting something more gradual. He was a serious child with a strong capacity for focus and a streak of stubbornness that both his parents recognized with the sheepish acknowledgement of people who have seen it in their own mirrors. By the time Robert was 3, Hartwell had grown enough that the church was finally finished, and the school had a full-time teacher, a young woman named Miss Abernathy who had come from back east with modern ideas about education that the town received with a mixture of appreciation and suspicion. A new hotel had been built with 2 actual stories. The Mesa Tan Saloon had been joined by a second saloon on the other side of town, and there was now a land office and a telegraph office, which connected Hartwell to the wider world in a way that the town was not entirely sure it wanted to be connected, but was glad of nonetheless. Emmett Burke's ranch had expanded, partly because of Gilbert's work on the water system, and several other improvements that Burke was too practical not to implement. Gilbert had moved from ranch hand to something closer to foreman, a shift that came without formal announcement, only with the gradual increase of responsibility and wages that indicated Burke's assessment of where Gilbert's value to the operation lay. Clara Burke declared regularly that Gilbert Talbot was the best thing that had happened to that ranch since rainfall, which she meant as the highest possible compliment, and Burke expressed the same view in the quieter form of continued respect. Me's shop had grown to the point where she and Eliza could not handle the volume alone, and she had taken on a second helper, a Mexican woman named Constanza whose skill with fine work, the delicate embroidery and lace-making that Me had never had the patience to develop fully in herself, was exceptional. Me paid both of her helpers fairly, which was a point of comment in Hartwell because Constanza was Mexican, and there were people in the territory in 1882 who did not think Mexican women should be paid the same wages as white women for the same work, and Mae Covington Talbot's opinion of such people was expressed primarily by ignoring them and paying Constanza fairly anyway. Gilbert had married, among other things, a woman of principle, which he had known from the beginning, and which continued to occasion in him a warm and particular pride. They had a second child in the summer of 1883, a daughter this time, who arrived with the same weather-appropriateness of her brother, though in her case it was the fierce blazing heat of a July afternoon rather than a December wind, and she was small and fiercely loud and absolutely certain of her opinions from the first moment, which everyone agreed suggested she would grow up to be exactly like her mother, which Me received as the compliment it was. They named her Clara Rose Talbot, Clara for Emmett Burke's wife, who had done more for their family than any neighbor had a strict obligation to do, and who cried when she heard the name, properly and without apology. Rose because it was Me's mother's name, a grandmother who had died in Ohio when Me was 14, and whom he still thought of with the kind of clear-eyed affection that endures beyond grief into something settled. Robert was 3 years old when Clara Rose arrived, and received her with the enormous seriousness of a child who has been told he is going to be a big brother and has fully committed to the responsibility. He brought her small gifts from around the house, a pebble he considered beautiful, a piece of ribbon, a wooden button he had found in the shop, laying them on her blanket with the ceremony of a person who understands that new arrivals require welcome gifts. Mae watched this and said nothing to Gilbert, but he caught her looking at Robert with an expression that he had come to understand, was how she looked when something moved her too much for words. The house behind the shop had been expanded by then, Gilbert having spent most of 2 summers adding a bedroom and a porch, and improving the kitchen, so that the whole structure was no longer the modest and slightly improvised thing he had moved into, but something that had become deliberately, sturdily a home, the kind of home that knows what it is. He had put a rocking chair on the new porch because Mae liked to sit in the evenings when the day's work was done and look out at the desert in the last of the light, and he often sat beside her in the second chair he had also built, because if there was a rocking chair on a porch, then there ought to be 2. And they sat and rocked in the desert evenings of New Mexico in the mid-1880s, and talked, and did not talk, and listened to the sounds of their children inside the house, and the sounds of the desert beyond the edge of town, and felt, both of them, the deep, quiet fullness of a life that had become what it was supposed to be. Gilbert still had Mae's photograph on the wall of their bedroom, still in the frame she had made, the small tintype of the serious young woman in the photographer's chair. He looked at it sometimes in the way you look at a thing that marks the distance between who you were and who you are, and he thought about Pete Garrity's trading post, and the cold afternoon, and the second-hand coat, and the stiff rectangle in the breast pocket, and he thought about all the ways this could have gone differently. If he had not put his hand in the pocket before reaching his horse, if he had tucked the photograph back into the coat and returned it to the rack, if he had taken it to Pete and let Pete handle it, if he had told himself it was not his business and ridden north without it. He thought about those 4 words on the back, "Do not forget me," and he thought about the fact that he had remembered her, this woman he had never met, this photograph of a stranger, with a fidelity that made no practical sense and turned out to be the most important thing he had ever done. One evening in the fall of 1885, when Robert was almost 5 and Clara Rose was 2, and the desert autumn was doing its particular work of making the light golden and the air electric, Gilbert sat on the porch while Mae put the children to bed, and he had the coat draped over the back of his chair. It was worn at the elbows now, the same elbows that had been worn when he bought it, which meant it was thoroughly worn, a working coat, a coat that had been through considerable weather and considerable country and considerable life. He had considered replacing it more than once and had not out of sentimentality exactly, or not only out of sentimentality, but also because it was still a good coat, still warm, still sound where it mattered. Mae came out and sat in the other chair and looked at the coat. "You should get a new coat," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "But you are not going to. Probably not this winter." She shook her head slightly, but she was smiling, and the smile was the one she had that was not for the public, that was only for him, the particular private smile that had become, over the years of their marriage, his single most favorite thing in the visible world. "Emmett Burke asked me today," Gilbert said, "if I would consider taking a partnership stake in the ranch." He had been holding this information since midday, turning it over, waiting to tell her. "He wants to start drawing back from the daily running of things. His hip has been troubling him for 2 seasons. He said he would take payment in work rather than cash, 7 years of continued labor, and then the East Quarter is mine outright." Mae was quiet for a moment, looking at the desert, where the last of the day was going pink and red behind the mesa. "That is good land," she said. "It is good land," he agreed. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I would talk to my wife first." She turned her head and looked at him, and the look was the kind of direct, clear, fully present look that was so essentially Mae that it had become the face he saw when he closed his eyes and thought of her. Not any other expression, not the composed face from the photograph, but this one, alive and direct and knowing. "Then I am telling you," she said, "to say yes." He said yes. Burke accepted his hand on it with the gravity of a man who takes handshakes seriously, which Gilbert had always respected, and the arrangement was settled, and Gilbert Talbot, who had ridden into Colorado from Missouri with a horse and a bedroll and the wish to be somewhere else, had become, in the measured and unhurried way that the West rewarded real work, a man with a stake in the land and a place that was fully and irrevocably his. The years that followed built steadily on that foundation. The east quarter of the Burke Ranch was good cattle land and good land generally, and Gilbert worked it with the same focused competence he had brought to everything, learning the particular character of this specific piece of earth, where the water ran and where it did not, where the grass grew thick and where the soil needed help, the patient and ongoing conversation between a rancher and his land that is really a conversation about what is possible when you respect something enough to learn it properly. Clara Burke's health had declined by 1887, a gradual waning that she met with the matter-of-fact courage she brought to everything, and me visited her regularly and brought food, and sat with her in the way of a friend who does not need to fill a room with words, and Emmett Burke was grateful in the way of a man who does not say grateful easily, but means it completely. Clara Burke died in the spring of 1888, quietly and at home, and Emmett Burke was diminished by it in the way that a person is diminished when the longest and most important relationship of their life ends, not broken but smaller, the way a house looks smaller without its largest inhabitant. He came to Sunday dinners at the Talbot house every week through the rest of 1888 and into 1889, which me had insisted upon, and which Gilbert enforced with the gentle firmness of a man who understood that solitude is sometimes the thing a grieving person chooses, and what they actually need are the obligations that pull them out of it. Robert, who was 8 by 1888, adopted Burke as something between a grandfather and a teacher, and Burke taught the boy the things that old ranchers teach curious children: how to read weather in the clouds and track animals by the signs they leave, and tell the age of a horse by its teeth. And Robert received all of this with the earnest focus that was his primary characteristic, and retained it with a thoroughness that delighted the old man. Clara Rose was 5 in 1888, and was exactly the person everyone had predicted she would be from the moment she arrived loudly, and with opinions into a July afternoon. A small, determined, bright girl with me's directness, and what appeared to be Gilbert's stubbornness and some third quality that was entirely her own. A kind of ferocious generosity, the need to give things to people, to press gifts and attentions and affections on everyone she loved, which was a wide category in her understanding. She brought wildflowers to Emmett Burke every time she saw him, which he accepted with a solemnity that told you he understood the importance of accepting what is offered in the spirit it is given. In the winter of 1889, me told Gilbert over breakfast in the kitchen where she had told him about Robert and about Clara Rose, setting her coffee cup down with that particular deliberateness, that there was going to be a third child. He looked at her across the kitchen table, this woman he had loved for 10 years, who still had the same direct eyes and the same quality of patience that was not waiting now but contentment, and he felt the same thing he had felt both times before, the large, slightly alarmed happiness that came from loving more than he had thought he had capacity for. "Are you pleased?" she asked, with a slight hesitation that told him she was asking about herself as much as about him, checking his face to confirm what she already felt. "Me," he said, "I am never not pleased when you tell me something like this." She relaxed in that small, controlled way she had when she had been bracing for something and the brace turned out to be unnecessary, the way a person shifts when they set down a weight. "Good," she said. "Because I am very pleased, and I think we are going to need to expand the bedroom again." He expanded the bedroom again that summer, doing it himself over several weekends, because he had learned that there was a particular satisfaction in building the things your family lived in, a satisfaction that was not available in any other form of work. Their third child, another boy, was born in August of 1889 in the summer heat like his sister before him, which seemed to be the family's pattern, Summer for girls and heat, December for boys and cold. Though this boy disrupted that theory by arriving in August, a small and apparently determined departure from precedent. They named him William James Talbot, William for Gilbert's father and James, because me liked the sound of it with William, and they agreed that was sufficient reason. William was different from his siblings from early on, a quieter child, more inclined to watch than to act, with large calm eyes that observed everything around him with a thoroughness that sometimes made adults feel they were being evaluated by someone much older. Me said he reminded her of Gilbert at the first, and Gilbert said he hoped not because he objected to himself, but because he thought William deserved to be his own person. And me laughed and said that was exactly the kind of thing Gilbert would say, which confirmed her point. Hartwell in 1890 was a different town than the one Gilbert had ridden into in October of 1878, larger and more settled, with a proper school and 2 churches, and a new water system that had been a town project of considerable effort and political complexity, and a railroad spur that had come through in 1887 and changed the character of the cattle business entirely, making the old drives less necessary and the market more accessible, and the ranching operation more businesslike if somewhat less romantic. The territory was pressing toward statehood, New Mexico still some years away from achieving it, but the conversation very much ongoing. And there was a self-consciousness about this that expressed itself in civic improvements and public projects, and the general posture of a community that is trying to demonstrate it deserves to be taken seriously. Me's shop had continued to grow, and by 1890 was genuinely a business rather than a personal practice, with Eliza now effectively managing the day-to-day, while Me took the commissions that required her particular level of skill. And Constanza's work had achieved a regional reputation for the fine decorative needlework that was now as much a part of the Covington shop's identity as the practical tailoring. Me had also begun doing something she had not planned on, teaching. Not formally, not at the school, but in her own shop on 2 afternoons a week she taught young women and girls the craft of sewing, which she had first offered as a favor to a neighbor and which had expanded because she was good at teaching, and because there was, in Hartwell as everywhere in the West, a real and practical need for women to have useful skills. She taught without charging the students who could not afford it, and she charged the ones who could, and the 2 groups sat side by side at the long worktable without distinction, which was, again, a position that some people in Hartwell had views about, and which Me disregarded with the complete and untroubled efficiency of someone who does not regard other people's prejudices as her problem to accommodate. Gilbert had completed his 7 years with Burke, and the East Quarter was now in his name, a legal fact recorded in the Hartwell Land Office that he had read on the document 3 or 4 times simply because it still struck him as extraordinary. He and Emmett Burke had shaken hands over it, and Burke had given him a bottle of whiskey he had been saving for an occasion. And that evening at the Talbot house, they had drunk a glass of it together on the porch in the autumn evening, the 2 of them and Me. And Burke had said, in the sparse way he had of saying important things, "Your father would have been pleased with you." And Gilbert had not trusted himself to say anything for a moment, and then had said, "Thank you, Emmett," and left it there, which was exactly the right amount. He expanded the cattle operation on the East Quarter over the next several years, not dramatically but steadily, the way a person builds who is building for permanence rather than impression. Robert, who was 14 in 1894, began working alongside his father on weekends and school holidays, with a capability that suggested he had been paying attention to everything for years without making it obvious, which was a quality he had clearly inherited from Me. Clara Rose at 11 was a terror of focused energy, simultaneously helping in the shop after school and conducting a campaign to have a proper library established in Hartwell, a campaign that she pursued through a combination of letter writing, petition, and the particular social pressure that comes from being a small, extremely determined girl who is very difficult to say no to. William at 5 was still watching everything and beginning to talk about what he observed in the considered way of someone who has been thinking about things longer than most people would before speaking. The family had developed its rhythms and its traditions, the Sunday dinners that always included Emmett Burke and increasingly included other people, neighbors and working hands, and whoever Mae had decided needed a good meal that week. The summer evenings on the porch. The way Mae still sat with her coffee in the mornings before the household woke and Gilbert would come and sit beside her, and they would have 20 minutes of quiet that belonged to them alone before the children and the day arrived. The way she still read his face when something was on his mind and asked the right question to open it, without preamble, without circling. The way he still found himself looking at her sometimes across a room and feeling the simple, unreasonable gratitude of it, that he had been cold in October of 1878 and needed a coat. He thought about that sometimes, the smallness and randomness of the pivot point. He had not been looking for anything. He had found it anyway. The whole cathedral of his life had been built on the foundation of a second-hand coat and a photograph in the breast pocket and the decision, made in a cold Colorado street with a horse and no good reason, to take it back to the person who had written, "Do not forget me," in careful, slightly uncertain handwriting on the back of her own portrait. There was a morning in the spring of 1895 when Robert was 15 and had taken on the early cattle feeding so that his father could sleep in, which he did not need to do and had offered without being asked. And Gilbert woke to the sound of his son moving the cattle in the early light and lay next to me in their bed with the window open, and the spring air coming in warm and smelling of the particular smell of the New Mexico spring, and Mae was awake next to him with her eyes open. And he said quietly, "Are you all right?" She turned her head to look at him. "More than all right," she said. "I was just thinking." "About what?" She was quiet for a moment, the way she was quiet when she was organizing something true. "Do you remember," she said, "when I gave you the photograph to keep? When you first came back from Colorado after you had brought it back to me, I pressed it into your hand and you looked at me like you were not sure if I was giving you a gift or asking you something." "I remember," he said. "I was asking you something," she said. "I did not have the words for it yet, but I was asking if you would stay. Not just come back, but stay. And you understood that, I think, even though I did not say it." "I understood it," he said. She turned on her side to face him fully. In the morning light, in the house they had built together behind the shop she had started from nothing, with 3 children in the rooms around them, and a cattle operation on the East Quarter and 17 years of a shared life, Mae Covington Talbot had the same eyes she had always had. The patience was there, as it always was, but it was not waiting now. It was arrived. It was the patience of someone who has got the thing they were patient for and discovered it was worth every moment of the waiting. "I am glad you stayed," she said. "I am glad I found a coat," he said, and she laughed. The same real laugh he had first heard in that October dusk on the edge of town, the laugh that surprised her a little, and he pulled her close and held her in the morning light with the spring air coming through the window and the sound of their son and the cattle outside, and the whole wide settled fact of the life they had made together. And everything that mattered was here in this house, on this land, in these rooms, and nothing was lost or unfinished or unresolved. He still had the coat. It hung on a peg near the back door, too far gone now for serious work but too significant to discard. A brown wool coat worn soft at the elbows, bought second-hand at a trading post in Colorado for $1.25 on a cold afternoon in the fall of 1878. The pocket was empty now, the photograph on the wall of the bedroom where it belonged, safe in its frame. But he knew the shape of the coat's breast pocket as well as he knew anything, the slight stiffness of the fabric at the opening, the depth of it, the way something rectangular and important could sit there against your heart all day without your knowing. Robert would take over the East Quarter someday. He knew it and was glad of it, because the boy had the right understanding of the land. the respectful, patient understanding that you cannot teach, but can only model. Clara Rose would do whatever Clara Rose decided to do, and it would be considerable, because she was her mother's daughter in the ways that made her mother formidable and her own self in ways that were not yet fully visible but already unmistakable in their direction. William would find his own course, the quiet, observant boy who was taking in the whole world and processing it in whatever deep interior way he had, and whatever he came to would be arrived at seriously and held with conviction. Emmett Burke died peacefully in 1897, in his own house, in his own bed, at an age that represented a life decently long and fully used, and he left his remaining property divided between Gilbert and a nephew in Texas, which surprised Gilbert and which he told me he did not feel he deserved, and me said that Emmett Burke had known his own mind, and that what he had felt Gilbert deserved was his business, and that was the end of the conversation. They planted a tree for Burke in the yard of the Talbot house, a cottonwood, because Burke had mentioned once that he had grown up near a cottonwood creek in Kansas, and that there was no sound on earth better than cottonwood leaves in a wind. The cottonwood grew, as cottonwoods do when given water and time, with a determined, generous abundance, and in a few years it was shading a corner of the porch and dropping its cottony seeds every spring in a way that was both beautiful and mildly inconvenient, and they loved it extravagantly anyway. On their 20th wedding anniversary in the spring of 1899, Gilbert gave me a gift he had been working on for months in the evenings when she was in the shop or dealing with the children. He had made her a small writing desk, fitted with a compartment for letters and a surface of polished wood. From timber he had selected and worked himself, and he had fitted the interior of the writing compartment with a piece of fabric, the last remaining scrap of the blue-green calico from the bolt he had brought from Colorado in 1879, the color that had made him think of her when he first saw it. She opened the gift at the kitchen table and looked at it and then looked at him, and it took her a moment before she recognized the fabric, and when she did, the expression on her face was the one he could not describe, the large, private, complete one, the one that told him everything she felt without any words being required. 20 years, she said. 20 years, he said. She ran her fingers over the fabric lining. You kept a scrap of it all this time, she said. I kept it for something worth keeping it for, he said. She stood up from the table and crossed to where he was standing and put her arms around him, and he held her the way he had held her at the door of her shop on a warm April day in 1879, when she had come out without her coat because she had been listening for the sound of his horse, and had moved quickly, impulsively, the most impulsive moment he had ever seen from her, and he had understood then what it meant that she had stopped waiting. He understood it now too. He had understood it every day of the 20 years between. The West was changing, had been changing for years, the frontier closing in the way of things that are finite, the open land filling with settlers and fences and towns that wanted to be cities, the railroad threading itself through territory that had once required a man to ride 4.5 days on a horse to cover. New Mexico was still not a state in 1899, that would come later, but it was moving toward itself with the determination of a thing whose time was arriving. The world was becoming something different from what it had been in 1878, when Gilbert had pulled on a second-hand brown wool coat in a trading post in Colorado and found a photograph in the breast pocket. He was 52 now, still lean, his dark hair gone considerably gray at the temples in a way that me told him with authority looked distinguished, and which he did not believe for a moment but accepted because she said it with the calm conviction she brought to true things. Me at 47 was exactly herself, the years visible in her face in the way of someone who has spent her life in the sun and the work and the weather of an actual life rather than a preserved one, and she was more beautiful to him at 47 than she had been at 26 in the photograph, which he would have said was impossible when he found the photograph, and which turned out to be simple fact. There were mornings now, more often than before, When Gilbert went to the peg by the back door and put on the old brown coat just to do the early chores, not the ranch work, that required proper gear, but the household chores, the filling of the wood box and the checking of the water, the simple work of a morning before the day properly began. The coat was soft with age and wearing, and it settled on his shoulders the way it always had, as though it had been made for him, and he walked out into the mornings of New Mexico with the coat on his back and the photograph on the bedroom wall and the sound of the house behind him coming awake. Me in the kitchen, the children moving, the cottonwood tree beginning to shift in the morning wind, and he stood in the yard of his house on his land in his life and felt the impossible, ordinary, specific weight of gratitude that belongs to a man who has found himself exactly where he is supposed to be. He thought about the trading post on cold October days. He thought about the coat on the rack and the $1.25, and the photograph slipping out of the breast pocket like a message that had been waiting a long time for the right person to receive it. He thought about the words on the back, in their careful handwriting, and what it had cost me to write them, and what it had meant that a stranger who was not yet her husband had read them and taken them seriously enough to ride 4.5 days south through cold country just to put the thing right. He thought that sometimes the most important things in a life are accidents. Not mistakes, but genuine accidents. The unplanned conjunction of a cold day and a second-hand coat and a pocket that had not been cleared, and a man who might have put the photograph back on the rack and ridden north and never thought of it again, but who chose instead, for no good reason except that the words would not let him go, to set out south and keep riding until he found her. And he thought that the accident had been, in the end, the truest thing that had ever happened to him, and that truth and accident were not as different as people like to suppose, because the accident had led him exactly, unerringly, to the person and the place and the life that were his, and there was nothing accidental about how right it was. He came to the back door in the early morning with a cup of coffee, her hair down, the blue robe she had made herself from a particularly soft piece of flannel 2 winters ago, and she held the cup out to him, and he took it, and she leaned against the door frame, and they looked at the morning together. The pale high sky of the New Mexico morning, the mesa solid and red in the early light, the cottonwood moving, the town of Hartwell beginning its day a 1/4 mile to the west. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "October of 1878, he said. She smiled. "The coat." "The coat," he said. She looked at the coat on his back. "I suppose we will never be rid of it," she said fondly, not complaining. "No," he said. "I suppose we will not." She reached out and straightened the collar, a small habitual gesture she had made 1,000 times, and her fingers rested briefly on his shoulder, and he covered her hand with his own. They stood in the morning of their life, these two people who had found each other by accident and built everything by intention, and the day was coming in warm and full over the mesa, and the children would be awake soon, and there was work ahead and all the ongoing business of a life that was whole and real and fully, thoroughly, irreversibly theirs, and not one word of it had been forgotten.